And protect us. Holy Spirit. Amen.
Hello.
Hello.
Shalom.
Welcome to Wellness Wednesday.
Bienvenidos. It's Wednesday, and we're here to talk about microbiomes. I'm Dr. Jeremiah, and this is Dr. Julie Stevens.
Hello.
Thanks for tuning in. Do you want to speak a little bit on what the microbiome is and what?
Yeah. So microbiome is a topic that has come up in the last many couple of years. Um, and the microbiome is essentially the collection of microorganisms, bacteria, virus, yeast, the living organisms that are on us and in us and around us that are part of the human experience. So, our bodies, when we're born, we are essentially sterile coming out of the womb. And then from our first experiences of breastfeeding, we get, and the birth process, we get, I'd say, inoculated with a layer of our garden, and then that builds, in our first, well, our whole life. We are not just human cells. We also have a microbiome. And actually, if we look at the numbers, we're probably about 10%, 8 to 10% human. And then the other 90% of cells on us and in us are our own personal microbiome. Microbiome shift very rapidly. So a week later, 24 hours later, we can have effects on us. And then, so then when you're looking at health and you're looking at the whole process of restoring someone's health and, what could go wrong and all of this, or what could go right, well, a lot of times we'll look at, say, heart disease and atherosclerosis and plaquing. Clogged arteries are suspected to have some influence there with the microbiome that's residing in the vessels, this kind of thing. So it's not, when you're starting to look at the whole health, it's not necessarily just your organs and your human part of you, but you also have these symbiotic process. In our gut, a lot of times when people talk about the microbiome, they're talking about just in the gut, but there is a microbiome on our skin and in all of our organs. But the gut, that's where, eating plants and the microbiome, what it does is it protects us from toxic exposures. It also works with our immune system as an immune regulator within our body. It also can help us excrete waste and move things. So the microbiome is kind of part of us, and yet a decade ago or 15 years ago, it wasn't necessarily spoken about.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like a new discovery. And then as
Hmm.
we look further, and then even in the last year, the newer discovery was legitimizing, no, there is microbiome in all of our organs too. But generally, when people talk about microbiome, they're really talking about the digestion.
That's probably, yeah, there's the
Yeah.
biggest variety of things. Well, not, I don't know, the biggest quantity for sure of bacteria, yeast,
Mm-hmm.
potentially parasites.
Mm-hmm.
So there are beneficial things and not such beneficial things, and then some really toxic things that can live in our bodies. So when we
Mm-hmm.
get an infection, that's essentially a dysregulation in our microbiome because a pathogenic organism has taken over and is growing too fast or too much, where we definitely need certain bacteria and certain organisms that are present that are causing actually promoting health, helping us with nutrient absorption, nutrient conversions into useful
Yeah.
forms, and just yeah, preventing the takeover of these pathogenic things. If you have a healthy microbiome, oftentimes even if you get a small exposure to something that is toxic, a pathogenic bacteria that would be problematic or other type of
Right.
organism.
C. difficile.
Correct.
C. diff.
Yeah, C. difficile is a bacteria that can live in your gut and cause no problems, but then you take an antibiotic for some other condition and wipe out a lot of your beneficial bacteria, and all of a sudden C. diff goes nuts, grows too rapidly into too much, and starts causing really severe, potentially
Mm-hmm.
life-threatening diarrhea and bleeding and all kinds of
So
problems.
that's an extreme example, but that is
Yeah.
this kind of
So
example.
yeah, we need this. We need a balance. We want healthy things there, and we want the non-healthy things to either be kept at very low levels or not at all. So,
I'm with you.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
We all have some dandelions in our, dandelions in the lawn, but you don't want to see a lawn completely overrun with dandelions. Then I don't care how, oh, those microbes aren't that bad, but if there's too many of them,
Mm.
now it's disrupting the overall
Choking out the
landscape.
grass and
Yeah.
the stuff you want to promote.
And then there's different types of weeds, there's like real like ones that could, have the thorns, have the thistles, and then there's other types that are minor and you don't mind them except if you just don't want it to overtake.
Sure.
So same kind of thing works in the microbiology world of microbiome.
All right. Well, I wanted to just talk a little bit today about a couple different ways to test your microbiome. There's different labs out there that have different
Well,
testing procedures. Or do you
and,
want to say
and
something first?
and what are the things like what are the things we think of when we're like suspecting
Hmm.
common conditions that we're suspecting the microbiome plays into this? Like when I think of someone who's having issues with like hives and histamine and allergies, my brain goes microbiome.
Hmm.
Microbiome first. When I think of like um, even as simple as like this person just their odor's a little different, like, oh, people who are kind of battling bad breath, as simple as that sounds, it's like, oh, there's a microbiome thing. Um,
I mean, how many people complain of digestive problems, whether that's,
mhm.
indigestion, constipation, diarrhea, like there's some imbalance in your digestive processing and usually is correlated with an imbalance in your microbiome, not as much diversity of beneficial things as we want, and
Mhm.
possibly too much of a pathogenic or potentially like a borderline bacteria or something that can take off too fast.
And now that I'm sitting here thinking about it, like I can't think of one like like chronic issue that doesn't maybe have a microbiome
Microbiome
aspect
related.
to it. Because I'm like sleep disorders,
Mhm.
neurologic disorders, like Parkinson's. Their thinking begins, 12 to 15 years prior as a microbiome issue of maldigestion of a protein. It ferments. The
Mm.
maldigestion protein breaks down just how we break down our regular protein in our diet. Something is happening, and it then exuding a toxic inflammatory response, which is then traveling up your nervous system, which then is irritating specifically the dopamine receptors for the Parkinson aspect in the midbrain, hindbrain, the aspect where the Parkinson's happens, and then 12 to 15 years later, then it starts to affect that's when we see the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
But taking down the root cause, you start to see where inflammatory aspects can go wrong, causing some fire, and then
Mm-hmm.
so it's where also people, if they're talking about proactive or trying to recover from a stressful period, it is a place that just with your daily habits you can help recover yourself.
Autoimmune conditions. From a
Autoimmune,
naturopathic point of view, we almost always
mm,
think the first place to kind of address is try to work on healing the digestive tract, getting things back to balance.
skin issues,
Hmm. Yeah.
eczemas and rashes.
So yeah, almost any, if someone's dealing with some sort of chronic health issue, if you do a microbiome test, there's going to be some imbalance that shows up.
Well, and also if you start to go down a rabbit trail of like toxic exposure, like the mama bear in me, I like the idea that when I'm as simple as sending some, apple slices and like, hey, have you had some fruit today? Like getting more plants in the kids' diet, I know is protecting them
Mm.
from their exposures out in the world. So it's like if you can feed and support the microbiome, you know,
Yeah,
come what may, living in modern 2025.
yeah, and plants, yeah, variety of plants is probably the best way to heal our microbiome. That's historically how humans have eaten, and we've
Hmm.
developed these relationships with plants and beneficial bacteria in our bodies that kind of grow in the soils and end up in our digestive tracts that cause health promotion activity. So, yeah, a wide variety. And then some modern farming practices with massive doses of pesticides and herbicides wipe out some of these beneficial bacteria, so that relationship's been disrupted. Glyphosates, especially, which are used, they're starting to pulling back in some cases because they've gotten sued too much over them recently for neurological illnesses. But there's still other pesticides and herbicides being, blasted on conventional produce, and that is disruptive for sure. So
Hmm.
a wide variety of organic foods and veggies. I think fermented foods also is a good place to be because fermenting allows the certain bacteria to take over. especially like the lactobacillus bacteria, like the acidophilus and things like that, tend to come out quite strongly when you ferment cabbage, like in sauerkraut or Korean like Napa cabbage with kimchi's or kombucha teas and
Hmm.
things like kefirs and yogurts and things like that brings a lot of these beneficial bacteria to higher and higher levels, then where they're more bioavailable when you eat them.
Yeah, and these beneficial bacteria that are living in our gut, that's really, they reside kind of, the majority of them are in the small intestine and then down into the large intestine. And so sometimes when we're eating like fermented foods or food in general, it's supposed to in this stomach, you swallow our food, in the stomach. Well, first in the mouth, we chew, and then the enzymes get excreted, but the saliva takes like a pulse check on like, hey, what food is coming in? And then that sends a signal further down into your pancreas of like which enzymes to produce to help you digest your food. In the stomach, you're supposed to have a very low acid level. It's by design more of a pH of similar to battery acid, and it's to clean the food, strips the viruses, cleans any parasitic load, any dirt, any E. coli, especially that's coming into, we're having a lot of outbreaks of E. coli in our food supply. But the stomach is supposed to be low acid to clean. One of the things that can chronically go wrong in the microbiome is people struggle with like ulcers and H. pylori and high stress. High lifestyle stress will alter the acid level in our stomach. So then microbes are able to continue further and into
Mm.
the small intestine. And so the small intestine is kind of like our personal mother load of our microbiome, and that's what we need to kind of protect. Um, on the other, so it starts, good digestion starts kind of in the stomach, but then also as it goes further, so you're supposed to have more microbes in the gut, in the small intestine, and different stressful events can make the intestinal bacteria overgrow even further. So now SIBO is a common stress example, common stress situation in our human experience. And that is an overgrowth of bacteria and microbiome in the small intestine. This is often gas, bloating, not feeling well. And then on the opposite side, the colon then gets a drop in level of bacteria, and then we'll have lower levels in that aspect, and then eventually you get out into the toilet. So there's common patterns of stress that are happening in our digestive tract that can be reflected then by the microbiome. And basically, we need to, if someone is challenged with like bowel irregularity and bloating, and some people the fermented foods help, some people the
Mm.
fermented foods just set them off. That so finding your way when you
Same with
take,
fibers as well.
right, and
Fibers
so
are kind of like a prebiotic type
that's where
food.
I was trying to get to.
Yeah.
That the bacteria, that the fermented foods, it's like when you take good bacteria and you're not actually like swallowing the bacteria and it stays alive all the way into your gut. What you're doing is you're feeding your own kind of, with your own compost pile, the plant fibers are feeding this mothership of microbes that are in our small intestine.
Mm.
It's about feeding the good guys
Right.
rather than like replacing them.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's a delicate balance, and that's why sometimes using, if you're not sure what to do, what's going on, sometimes doing some of these testing procedures can be helpful to see what
Mm.
is really going on in your gut, and then that can give you an indication of what's going on in the rest of your body as well. And so, yeah, do you want to get?
And you know what? You learn so much looking at you. It's like taking a personal sample and figuring out. So both of these tests we're going to talk about today are used clinically in different situations across the country in different um, two different common labs. We have,
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen here. So yeah, there's
these are
kind of
both poop tests.
yeah, so there are two different tests done from collecting stool samples, which obviously isn't the most fun thing to do in the world, but oops, I lost. Come back here.
If you do have to ever collect a stool sample, what this looks like while we're doing this technical stuff is you would take a very loose, large layer, you would lift up the toilet seat and you would take a large layer of saran wrap loosely placed. Then you would do your morning business or have your go to the bathroom, and then you lift up pour off the urine, and then there you have your sample sitting on the saran wrap, and then the lab will provide you kits. So both labs we use do provide um, collection kits, but neither one of these collection kits ever mention the use of saran wrap. And I just think that that is a very simple thing that we need, it
Mhm.
matters. Um,
Yeah, because
because
I
no,
mean,
yeah,
it's
there's easier
that's
ways
the easy
to
way to
do
do it. And
collecting
then you
samples.
basically, yeah, collect a small part of it that you send to the lab. So, I'll talk a little bit first about the complete stool analysis tests that can be run through doctor's data as the lab. Several labs, several kind of functional medicine labs offer these different types of testing. This is kind of an older test that we've used. It's been around for 20 years plus that we've been using with interesting results. Then I'll let you talk a little bit more about the newer kind of generation using DNA markers, since we have new technology that's really popped in the last decade or so. So, but this is kind of the newest. This is sort of the old approach, and it still actually has a lot of validity that can be useful. So this is a sample. Basically, it's kind of what a lot of times too what your local lab like LabCorp or Quest can do too, where you do like a parasite test where you collect 3 samples for parasite testing,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's also a stool culture aspect, and those sometimes can be covered by your
What are
insurance
they
if you're
looking for?
having well, in a
And is
parasite
that the same
test
as
is,
this?
yeah, this has this plus other things. So the parasite test, they're actually looking specifically with microscopes to see if there's, eggs or worms or parasitic things. And then a bacterial culture is basically they put out on like a plate, like a medium plate, like smears of samples, and then they see what grows and how much grows, and then they kind of isolate all the different bacteria and see what is specifically there from like growing out perspective. The newer tests basically they don't have to do that any longer. They can just look at DNA markers and see how much DNA is present from each of these different bacteria. So it is a little bit of a newer approach that can be done too, and that it can they both can be valid. But I think, yeah, I'll talk through this one a little bit first. So if you see here, it starts, the first result here is a culture, and that's again where they grow out and see what grows. And they will look at some, like 3 different categories. There's expected or beneficial flora, and we want these as high as possible. 4 plus is the highest the range goes. 0 would be none, or no, NG, no growth. 3 and 4s are kind of what you want to see in this category. And this is just, again, a sample report from a sample patient. Then they have sort of imbalanced flora, which, at small levels are fine, but at high levels it could be problematic. And then they have bacteria that you don't really want there. And like in this case, this person has an enterobacter that we wouldn't want there, and that's something that we wouldn't want to see. And so that would be something we want to address. And as we get later in the report, that you will see they kind of test that specifically against different natural and prescription antibacterials to see if they can knock it back. So this is specifically a culture just for bacteria. So they're looking at what bacteria grow, the good ones, the ones that are okay, and then the bad ones, and see what's growing out there. And then they kind of give you some information on that. They'll also do a yeast culture. So we want to see how much yeast grows out. So we don't want not a ton, or if, these normal ones, you can have small amounts. If you're seeing definitely yeast in the high numbers, that's something that's not, we don't want to have. And that often is a fairly common thing that can happen with someone, especially if you've taken a lot of antibiotics. You can get these yeast, because if you knock out the bacteria, then there's an open space, and nature doesn't like a void, so something moves into that space. Like if you have a garden and you wipe out the,
Mm-hmm.
pull the plants, weeds will start growing quick. There's an open space, so yeast are kind of like a weed that grows there, and so we don't really want a lot of yeast. It's growing in our system. There are a few candidas that are healthy, but there's definitely ones that we don't want, especially like Candida albicans and some other candidas and different yeasts that will grow and show up here. And again, if they do show up, this lab will test it against natural and anti fungal
And
medications.
yeast can have a symbiotic relationship to the human.
Mm-hmm.
Yeast will sequester, bind up heavy metals. So if you're having high mercury or aluminum or lead exposures, the yeast will sit there and bind up the circulating, the either exposure to the heavy metal or the circulating from the digestive space. So it
There are
will be
some
used to
specific
bind it.
probiotics, which we didn't mention earlier too, as a way to shift some of this. if you notice a lot of these beneficial things like lactobacillus, bifidobacter, those are often the two main ones in probiotics. Sometimes you have some of these other ones here too.
So
But
sometimes if yeast is reoccurring, or so there's, I guess what I'm saying is there's patterns to there, especially when something's reoccurring, you can kind of look at the larger picture with bifidos.
And then there are some, like you mentioned, there are some yeasts, especially like the Saccharomyces family. A lot of probiotics will have Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a yeast that's beneficial and can help actually as sort of a food source or a balancing for some of these beneficial bacteria. This one they didn't have a lot of yeast, so it's
This
not too
stuff works together
problematic.
in a garden. They're not, no one bacteria lives in isolation from everything else.
Then this lab will also do specific tests against looking at different bacteria and viruses. So things like norovirus, rotavirus are things we don't want in our system. Those cause, diarrheal infections and vomiting and things like that. Different bacteria that shouldn't be there, Campylobacter, the toxic E. coli. There are like a ton of different E. coli. Some are actually beneficial. E. coli 157 is the dangerous one that you really don't want present at all, and that's the one that's been associated with like fast food outbreaks and different lettuce outbreaks and stuff. So salmonella obviously is another bacteria. Shigella. These are things we don't want there. Cholera for sure we don't want there. But yeah, these are rarely ever. I mean, sometimes you will see some of these like salmonella pop up, but
We're seeing E. coli more and more just with our issues with our greens, you know,
Mhm.
farming too close to each other.
And they'll do specific tests for some parasites that are common and can cause like long-term diarrheal things like Cryptosporidium or Giardia, often gotten from contaminated water, camping and drinking water that's not purified and stuff can be a big source of Giardia.
And Giardia is the parasite that like that will get picked up in the, mainstream primary care clinic experience. They
Someone's having
do
chronic
a
diarrhea,
good
they'll
job
do
of
a test.
screening for
Yeah, you can
Giardia.
do.
Yeah.
They'll test sometimes for Cryptosporidium and
And
Giardia and
yeah,
Amoeba. Those are parasites that are often in contaminated water or non-purified waters.
especially up here in the Northwest.
True. And then this protozoa, this is just, I think, a microscope. Yeah, this is all microscopic examination. So they actually take the sample and look under a microscope to see if they notice any of these protozoa, which are single cellular organisms that we don't want there. Things like entamoebas, again, Giardia, so blastocystis. I've seen some of these pop up sometimes on these
Hmm.
tests on people who, especially if you've traveled a lot to foreign countries where the food sources and water sources aren't necessarily as purified as they are in this country. It is still possible in this country to pick up some of these things, or animals can bring in some of these things.
A lot of times, eating like straight from the garden, even like, well, sushi and picking and eating like straight from the raspberry bush, straight from the garden out in nature, you can actually have more of this than we realize.
This test is great if you've done a lot of traveling outside of the country too. We've seen people come back from, Africa or Asia or South America and pick up some of these things. They never well since traveling. Then this is a great test, or the GI map to see if there is something that you picked up that shouldn't be there. They do some microscopic examination for worms, tapeworms, roundworms. These things happen. We like to think that it's only bacteria and viruses that make people sick, but there are these parasites historically have been around.
Especially these roundworms, the Ascaris.
And those can
People who have,
chronic coughs, right?
yeah, issues in the lungs, asthma, exercise-induced asthma. It's worthwhile looking into this. There is a life cycle through the lungs, and many times kind of an atypical presentation of not extreme asthma, but just a little exercise-induced tolerance. I've seen good clinical
Yeah,
response.
that Ascaris is an interesting one because
There
its
is.
lifespan will spread to the lungs, which is we don't want to think these things they're kind of creepy crawly stuff, but they are out there and
I know.
they can cause illness for sure. Again, flukes, again, other worm-like things. Then they will look at some of these other markers, like for yeast. This is under microscope: yeast, red blood cells, white blood cells, muscle fibers. How well are you digesting your food? These you shouldn't have a lot of these things in your stool. They should all be broken down by the time it gets down there. Um, yeah, crystals, things like
Gives
that.
you some insight of how your digestive processes are happening and if there's, blood or signs of immune activity immediately in your stool.
Mucus, again, being another sign of inflammation that could be going on there.
That gives us clinically, if someone does something like this, then it gives you an idea for digestion, absorption. Here we have it can give you an idea, do you have an autoimmune process or an chronic infectious process? Give you a little more insight into the body beyond
And these tests are
bacteria.
kind of interesting too. For these are chemistry tests. If these are present, these are signs that how well you're digesting your foods. You want elastase, which is an enzyme that the body makes. It should be greater than this number. So that's something good you want to see. Fat, you don't really want to see a lot of fat in the stool. Your body should be absorbing all your fats before it gets to the stool. If it's not, there's often something wrong with your pancreatic enzymes or your gallbladder going on. Same with carbohydrates. We want to kind of absorb all your nutrients from your food, the fats and carbs. You don't want a lot of that stuff getting all the way to the end of your digestive tract. These three things can be markers of inflammation that, should be low. You want them all below these numbers. So if they're high, that can be an indication that there's some inflammation going there. Secretory IgA is an immune marker. You want you want some, but not too much. So if it's too high or too low, that can be indicative of some illness processes where you're not.
Yeah. This is where you can see how much fire you have in your gut.
Yeah.
If you're low, like chronically low, that is just, usually a common thing with that is just it is proof of high stress. And if it's chronically high, it can have proof of just basically an active fire happening. So like an active immune response that's not self-correcting, but it can give you a clue that, oh, not just in your, head or not just in your imagination, but there's something going on.
And then these short chain fatty acids are interesting because they are often the main food sources for your beneficial bacteria in your colon. Butyrate being one of the big ones. So we want a certain amount, but not too much again. Um, so yeah, butyrate is really the butter has a high level of butyrate. That's where the term comes from. So these are beneficial fats that sometimes are deficient in people. They're either not getting enough in their diet or not digesting your fats properly. We don't want these fat. These up here would be like a long chain fat. These are short chain fats, which are kind of specific for bacteria in the gut. Is what we want. pH, there's a range where it's healthy. Too acidic or too basic is problematic. Blood, obviously, you don't really want blood in your stool ever.
But it does
It does
happen, and you
happen.
want to,
Yeah.
yeah, it'll be quantified. If it's found, it'll be quantified. Low,
And
high,
I always think
yeah.
this is funny, like the color and consistency. Like, what a job having to help people like look at those things. But I guess that's part of the job they took on. Um, again, they kind of interpret some of these numbers for you and kind of what they mean. So yeah, if you do this test, you get these reports back and kind of shows you how to interpret it. And then lastly, like again, remember we talked about if there was bacteria or yeast present, then they grow it out and they culture it and do sensitivities. And so they test it like what's it sensitive to. So in this person sample report, they had this Enterobacter, which we didn't want to see. So they test it like, you want a high sensitivity. So these are some natural things that you could take to knock it out, like caprylic acid's medium. Uva ursi is an herb that could be high, and that would probably be good for this, knocking this person out if you didn't want to do antibiotics. Then they do test antibiotics as well. So like in this person's case, these different antibiotics like Bactrim or
So yeah,
Cept.
in this specific case of the Enterobacter this is kind of the like this is, I think, where the real wealth of knowledge and information for someone's care comes in, because here they found a high level of this one bacteria, okay? And then they looked at which herbs could address this infection and which antibiotic could address this infection. And so here, if you go to the antibiotic listing, more of our quote unquote gentler antibiotics, the amoxicillin and the ampicillin, that they're resistant. So this person would have to step up into like a Cipro or something,
Bactrim.
or Bactrim, a stronger known antibiotic, or rather, something like Uva ursi or, colloidal silver is great. So, but if you've been just taking a bunch of, say, olive leaf extract over and over and over, hoping to get better, and golden seal, which would be very smart herbs to take, but yet it's not doing anything. So it's kind of like helps you to direct where your efforts are and then make a choice. I could try this. Over Ursi essentially does not have the same, it has a very solid safety profile and does not have any of the risks that like Cipro or Bactrim are going to have long term for your gut. So it's just nice to be able to make choices that work for you.
Yeah, I really like we've seen these results where you can really target what's going on. I don't think this person had any yeast, so they didn't. So if there's a yeast
Mm-hmm.
strain there, they'll do the exact same thing and show sensitivities to, different antifungals and prescription antifungals too, so you can get targeted information there. And then also you can do follow-ups then after this, like after you do a course of one of these or multiples of these, then you can just repeat that specific part of this test and then kind of know to go, see what's going on if it's still there. Did you knock it back? Things like that. And sometimes these sensitivities will change. If you hit it for a long time with one of these, sometimes all of a sudden it will become resistant to it, which is kind of bacteria is very quick to,
Mm-hmm.
to develop resistances, which is
Well, they
challenging.
want to stay alive too. They're alive also. It's
Yeah,
true.
it's true. So yeah, this is a test, this complete stool analysis, comprehensive stool analysis that we have run. It's on our website at consultanaturopath.com. You can order it there, and you can also, schedule an appointment to talk with talk with us about this and how to interpret and, how to use this information going forward.
Yeah, because I think what's going on, is a lot of people they'll struggle with not feeling well in their gut, or they'll just kind of get used to having a stomach ache, or get used to feeling bloated, or get used, and there's other issues too, heartburn, but like, or just other extending issues. But sometimes you go to the doctor and you're like, hey, my stomach, and then it's like they'll go refer you over for a colonoscopy. You get the colonoscopy, you're told you're fine, and you're back to square one. And you're like, okay, well, now what do I do?
Sometimes
So
colonoscopy can make you worse because
there's
that
that,
clean out
that
process
clean
can
out
mess up your
process,
microbiome.
and that messes up the microbiome, and then also inserting the camera, looking around, it could, it's great. The early detection is great to know that there's not worse things, but just the process of going in and looking around can create its own
And it's not
issues.
a microscopic test at all. It's a visual, what macroscopic,
Right,
like
so
what
there's
they can
actually a
see.
camera.
Yeah, it's
So
what they can see, but you're not doing any of this microscopic microbiome
they're
testing,
just looking for pink skin or bright red skin,
or
or
cancer, or
or yeah,
ulcerations, or
a little
yeah,
bit of something growing,
yeah.
like actual like a polyp, or where this is looking more at a bacterial level. And the other test, a GI map.
Yeah, let's kick over there.
Okay,
Do
the
a sample report on that.
GI map's a little different.
Oops. Get to the back to this there.
I'm more familiar with using GI map in process. So this first page is essentially the things that could get people in the hospital. So these are kind of the overt infections that will.
And again, these are looking at DNA markers specifically for these things. So
Yeah,
using DNA is a cool technology we have now that they didn't have 20 years ago, really, to be able to look at all these specific things.
and so I've seen them be more sensitive and to give you a better, they're able to look for more. Then this next is H. pylori, and some people will say any H. pylori is too much H. pylori, but the problem with H. pylori is what it does is it stops the acid production in the stomach. And so when you block the acid production, that then has an influence on your body's like internal immune system all the way through. So it's not just H. pylori itself, it's also the what it affects downstream
And H.
by its
pylori
presence.
is highly associated with ulcers.
Oh,
They
yes.
used to think that, ulcers were just caused by stress, and this one doctor proved that no, actually, it's this bacteria that's causing it. I think if you're under high stress environments or situations, I think it
Hmm.
is more likely that this bacteria can take off as well. So there is still some connection with stress, but it isn't necessarily stress only that causes ulcerations. It's more
Well, and then
stress
high
plus this.
stress drops the immune in, SIGA.
Hmm.
That so high stress will lower your temporary immunity in the area, allowing some of these to set up camp. And then once they've set up camp, then your immune system has a hard time getting them out. So, okay. Here, the first step here is the first chunk of bacteria. These are your protective guys. These are the things you expect to see in your garden as you go through. And it's really nice to, I just like visually. I want to point out also that these numbers here, like for instance, I'm pointing.
Yeah,
Oh,
right.
there you go. So 3.2 e to the 11. This is a logarithmic scale. So e to the 7, the next line is much lower than e to the 11. There's just if you can imagine a
But they have, I
logarithmic
think
scale.
the band is pretty useful. There's
You want to
green, we
be
want to
in
be
the
in the green, so
green.
too high or
Yes.
too low is showing off, where
And
we don't want to be.
And these high amounts, so I'll go through that. You want to go, you essentially, you will look to see, you're looking to see the snapshot of how someone's variety of bacteria are, and then you influence somehow, whether that's improving the diet or using specific antimicrobial herbs or feeding the bacteria by good fibers and foods, and then you recheck again and see where you're at, and you'll see these things fall into the green. So so these are the things you expect to see and stuff. I mean, I can go on, but like Akkermansia is very important for our immune system. This Akkermansia muciniphila. So when this one is super low here, there I start to think about like autoimmune tendencies, very common. So this first area, these are the plants we expect to see. This second here, the bacteriophylla, it's kind of, it's really more about the balance of the two. Kind of gives you an idea how inborn metabolism and carbohydrate metabolism. Then we have the overgrowth bacteria, and the overgrowth bacteria give us some input into some of these things are over infections, and some of them are more together if collectively there's too many of them. Now we're looking at like a SIBO situation or a dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is a term of essentially saying bad bugs. The microbes are in a stressful grouping. There are specific bacteria that are correlated with autoimmune infections. It's very neat when you, especially if someone has an autoimmune condition, I would definitely put the time and energy, or a chronic infection situation, put the time and energy to see what your microbiome is doing. It will give you some insight specifically to you. So, I mean, talking about a general testing here is a little, it is what it is, I guess. But like for instance, this Klebsiella being high, this sample has autoimmune issues. You can just see it. Fungal and yeast. It is good to look at the yeast and the viruses in someone's stool. Oftentimes, remember, this is coming from the stool. So you can have, for instance, a person who's had Epstein-Barr exposure. In their blood work, their antibodies are high, but you're wondering if they are currently infected and if they're having shed. So this is only going to be released in the stool if someone is like currently infected and shedding that. Rather than I've experienced it once, my body came in contact with this virus, I built immunity, and now I'm no longer sick with this. Sometimes you have a hard time discerning which category someone is in. When you see it in the stool, they are actively shedding. Here, this balance of fungus and yeast, what can happen is people will struggle with the yeast infection. Then they'll be, mainstream is, what's that called? Diflucan. But then the microbes can be resistant to the diflucan. And so you'll see different forms show present. And diflucan is really great, but it only kills so much. It only kills about 80% of it. So then you have to find other things. These parasites and the different, similar to the testing, I will say, and I know, okay, so this parasite, yes, they're looking for DNA fragments in the stool reflecting these protozoa. The laboratory representatives tend to say that their labs are perfect and that they're not going to miss anything. But then when you talk to other clinicians who are actually in the field of parasites, then what will happen is people will treat with herbal or, safe compounded medications for parasites, and the person themselves will feel better even though their stool test came back negative. And so there is some discrepancy between what shows up when it comes to parasites. I trust the yeast, I trust the virus, I trust the bacteria 100%. The parasite thing, clinically, I don't always trust it. I have seen them come up positive, but I've also seen them come back negative, like a high rate of false positivity. No, false negative, and yet the person is still having some sort of digestive distress that matches a clinical picture of having a parasite, like symptoms worse at night, cravings, bleeding, constipation, I don't know, different issues that you're like, I wonder if this is parasitic, then you'll treat them and the issue will resolve. And I'll still wonder if it was parasitic that didn't show up.
Yeah, they said the old way, like on that previous test of looking for parasites under a microscope and just specifically looking under. Well, they usually do
But
three
that one
samples.
sample had
A
to
single
have it.
sample only has like about a 50 to 60% accuracy of catching a parasite, where
Mm-hmm.
like I think they say three consecutive samples, which is what that test has you collect, or three stool samples over 3 days, basically. Then that
Mm-hmm.
has well up to like 90-ish, 95% accuracy,
Mm-hmm.
but there's still some that are missed. It's just basically if it happens to be shedding in that sample. The thought that is that these DNA markers are maybe more sensitive, but I don't know if I've ever seen specific, testing. There's probably some lab test, not lab tests, like
It's
studies
not
done.
perfect. I
Yeah,
guess what I'm just trying to say is we are still in the infancy of this testing. It has made a huge step forward, but it's just not 100% perfect. We're trying. So then this intestinal health markers, this next piece here is so valuable. It is so cool. So steatocrit is fat in your poop, and it's letting you know how well your gallbladder and liver function is doing. This elastase is enzyme coming from your pancreas, saliva. It's important for how you process carbohydrates. This beta glucuronidase is like a liver, how your body is eliminating, able to eliminate excreted toxins like hormones and plastics and things in the liver pathway. Blood is to know if there's blood there. The immune response is always interesting, and this is where you really can see how chronic stress can build up and start to build in as a digestive, show itself in digestive dysfunction. The anti-gliadin, this is searching if you have wheat or celiac response.
yeah, that's useful to see for sure.
It's super useful. And if your total secretory IgA is exhausted, then this also anti-gliadin can be just a little bit lowered. And
Right.
so, which because overall, all of the IgAs, like the secretory IgA is a total IgA count, and anti-gliadin IgA is to one specific gliadin, what the protein found in wheat. Okay. And then the eosinophil activation protein, I see this when people are kind of allergic to everything a little bit. I say allergic, like UC, colitis, inflammatory bowel disease. That's the one I'm looking for. Um, I'm gonna calprotectin, more inflammatory bowel, and also when people get what they call leaky gut. If there's an issue happening within the tubing, how likely is that quote unquote problem going to transfer into the whole part of your body? So if your calprotectin is just a pulse of how much inflammation is going on in your gut, and then this add-on test was which gets added on to have proof of leaky gut. So zonulin is a test to see how open the gap junctions are, but the spaces between cells in the layer of your intestinal lining. So the zonulin gives you an idea of how quote unquote leaky your gut is. And then when you see inflammation markers, it can just give you a perspective of, okay, if there is a fire in the middle of your tubing, how likely is that fire going to cross over and have an effect in your body? Some people's guts are sealed, and so if they were to eat bad food, it just goes right through them and it doesn't bother their body at all. Other people's guts are not sealed, they're very open, and so anything that they're eating is essentially the next day. If they eat bad food, the next day they wake up and they're achy from head to toe, or they have a headache, or they feel off in the rest of their body, and they can give an idea of, okay, how open is this barrier between the outside world, which is mouth to bum. Technically, inside here is supposed to be kind of outside world. So you should have mechanisms to protect you so that if you get exposed to something, it gets all the way out. But what happens is this tubing can be intricate. All right. That is a snippet of,
And
okay.
then they specifically test if you did have H.
Mhm.
pylori, like what's it susceptible to or resistant to. Kind of that's the last page here, I think, right?
Mhm.
Oh, universal antibiotic resistant genes. That's kind of interesting. Yeah, if it's like different antibacterial
Trying to
antibiotics, are
look,
you
yeah.
do you have resistance genes present, like, where your body be more likely not to respond to those? So I will say, like, I think if you're working closely with a doctor, I do think this GI map test is the future, and I think there's more information here that's useful. I will say it's not as easy to self-interpret for someone who's not educated on these things. As you see, there's not a lot of explanation. It's just a whole bunch of numbers. So I think you really have to be working with
Hmm.
someone who can
This can
interpret this.
scare you if you don't understand it.
But I think that if you're doing like some self-testing and just, I think that like CSA, the complete comprehensive stool analysis, is a little more. They have a lot more interpretation and useful ways to use that data for yourself. So I think
Mhm.
I mean, now with Dr. Google out there, you can kind of interpret these yourself if you really go down that pathway. But I do think it is helpful to um, to use this test in conjunction while you're working with a doctor who can interpret it for you, or the
Mhm.
other test I think can be there. But they're both pretty valuable tests that give us information. I think, like we said earlier, I think almost every illness has some element that is affected in the digestive tract, whether it's causative or secondary to the illness in the first place. So I think, from a
Yeah, whether
naturopathic
it's
point of
chicken
view,
or egg.
if you don't know what to do, you treat the gut because, almost all illness has some digestive correspondence. If we can get the digestive tract working healthier, almost everything else starts improving to some extent. Whether it's sufficient is not always, but it's not going to hurt anything by making your digestive tract working more efficiently and healthier altogether. So I think these are pretty awesome tests that can give us information. I think a lot of times people just know that there's something wrong in their gut. Just doesn't seem like it works optimal. I mean, it's that rare person that says their digestion is perfect and they have no issues going on. Everyone has some bloating, constipation, diarrhea, or just
Yeah, urgency or lack of
yeah,
urgency, or, something.
something is
Yeah.
almost always off on every person if you dig a little bit to ask those questions. So I
And
think these are useful tests. If you want to do them yourself, we do offer them on the consultantnaturopath.com site. On the testing, you can order them there. We'll send you the kit. You collect the samples, and then you send them back to the lab. And then when we get the reports, we upload them to a secure server and email them to you that way. Or if you're working with someone, a naturopath, us or someone else, they can be interpreted by those, or a
Mhm.
functional medicine doctor who knows how to interpret it. You can take these labs to someone and have them through them with you as well. So just awesome information to have. And I think a real key point to just getting ourselves healthy, getting back on right tracks.
And this is an area too that when people start to make changes, they see benefits quicker. It's not, like when you're taking an MRI scan of your brain and you're
Stuff
watching like
here.
lesions change, you want that is a slow trajectory change. But when you're looking specifically in the microbiome and the digestive space, like a stool analysis, you see effects quickly.
Sure.
And then it's like, oh, okay. And when you know that the inflammation now is in one place, then that domino effect creates more beneficial change into the deeper systems in the body.
Absolutely. I think we'll leave it there unless you have anything else to add.
I think microbiome, it's a
Thanks for
place you can have
tuning
fun.
in. We'll be here next Wednesday, Lord willing,
All
and
right.
we'll keep going. All right. Thanks all. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.